from St. Louis.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Harold. I'm an alcoholic. It's great to be with you this evening. You're an hour ahead of me, but it's great to be here. And thanks for the invitation, Anthony, to come and share. I think I've been here before. I can't remember, but if I haven't, I'm glad to be here for the first time. If I'm coming back, I'm glad to be here again. Thank you for that. Michael, thank you for chairing the meeting. Welcome, Miguel, Melinda, Cheyenne, and Melissa as our newbies here tonight. We're glad you're here. My sobriety date is April 7th, 1987. My home group here in St. Louis, Missouri is called AA on the Rocks. And we meet on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock, speakers meeting. My sponsor for most of my sobriety was a gentleman named Tom I from North Carolina. My friend Nancy here knows Tom very well. Unfortunately, Tom has been ill with Alzheimer's, for about several years now, about 7 years, and is in a nursing home today. Not able to sponsor, obviously, anymore, but still sober. 64 years of sobriety Tom has, and made a huge difference in my life. My sponsor today is Steve L. from Nashville, Tennessee. He picked up that burden, if you wish, after Tom became ill, and so I've been walking with Steve since then. So. But I come from a great line of sponsorship. I have a solid 3 legacy home group. These are all things that made a huge difference in how my life turned out. And so I can't stress that enough. But I just want to start with good news, especially for the new people, and that there's hope. No matter how far down you went here, that you can be happy, joyous, and free. The definition of the 12 steps, or at least one of them, that gives us in the forward to the 12 and 12. And I'm not going to read it, but I'll paraphrase it. But it basically says the 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in nature. And if you adopt these way of life, if you live into these spiritual principles and adopt them as a design of living, it will expel the compulsion to drink and lead to a life where you become happy and usefully whole. That's a pretty awesome promise. That's way better than just not drinking anymore, because that's what it sounds like. At least it did to me when I first got here. We're just not going to drink anymore. And that didn't attract me at all. There was nothing about that got me excited. I didn't want to drink anymore. I had a deep desire not to drink, but the fact that intoxicating feeling wasn't going to be a part of my life anymore, again, this didn't excite me. It's a newcomers meeting, so I want to really frame it that way, I think, tonight. And what I like to talk about in these kind of meetings is really the 5 things that I call them the 5 big delusions. But these 5 big delusions were the things that I had to overcome, and I think most people have to overcome in their journey here in sobriety. And I'll weave my story as I talk about these 5 big delusions, because it'll work with the time frame that we have. And I think it'll encompass a lot of things, especially newer people will want to hang on to. But delusion number 1 is I'm not alcoholic. And that delusion wipes out most people, unfortunately. On page 30 of our big book, the first 3 words on that page are all in capital letters. Most of us. And it goes on to say, have been unable to admit that we're real alcoholics. And that, like I said, that delusion is powerful. It's not denial. Believing there's an element of denial to everything when it comes to an alcoholic, but the word denial is only mentioned twice in our big book. Once on page 10 in Bill's story, and then once in the spiritual appendix in the back of the book. And both times it's talking about denying a power greater than ourselves. But when the book talks about the illness, the malady, the disease, however you want to frame it, it talks about it on the basis of delusion or illusion, meaning I can't see myself for what I really am, and I can't differentiate the truth from the false. And that's the real big dilemma for the alcoholic. I'm not what you say that I am. I'm not what all the evidence says that I am. And I'm going to prove to you, myself, and everybody else that I can drink like other people with impunity without problems, because I love this stuff. And I did. I loved to get intoxicated. I loved everything about it. And I never imagined or dreamed that there would come a day where I would not live that kind of life. It just was the farthest thing from my conscience. But that's what happened, But so that first delusion is powerful, and we come about it in a lot of different ways. But it's there. We're in this pandemic time, this COVID-19. We're talking about coming back to meetings and finally maybe getting back to a little normalcy. But the COVID-19's killed over 2 million people. It's been an ugly, nasty thing. But the reality of it is, in 2020, King Alcohol by itself, nothing else with it, just King Alcohol by itself killed over 3.5 million people. That's not counting drunk driving accidents or, mix this with that or any of that kind of stuff. Robbery's gone bad, fist fights gone bad. It's just King Alcohol by itself, 3.5 million people. So it's an ugly, ugly illness. And if you Googled how many potential alcoholics there are in the world and then Google the census of how many people are in recovery, it's not even close. And so that tells you that most people will go on to the bitter end, just like the chapter, just like that paragraph ends with. It says that most people will go to the gates of insanity or death. And so if we're here tonight, and especially for Miguel and Melinda, Cheyenne and Melissa, if you have a desire tonight not to drink, I hope you hang on to that with everything you got. I mean, I really hope you do. I hope you cherish it for everything there is, because it can slip through your fingers and there's no guarantee you'll ever get it back again. And so it's a very, very sensitive thing, but it's also a whole lot of grace from God for us to be here tonight and be sober, because there's so many of us that won't. And but I'm forever grateful that I'm here. I was introduced to AA in 1979 in the Department of Corrections. That's where I was introduced to AA. In Adair County Detention Center in Kirksville, Missouri. I went to my first outside treatment center in 1980 as a plea bargain on another case that I caught. And they gave me the option to do 30 days there or go back and do 2.5 more years where I just came from. And I quit school when I was 13. So I knew that 30 days was a heck of a lot shorter than 2.5 years. So I took the 30 days. But I went to that treatment center and I approached that treatment center like I was going to do 30 days in the county jail. I mean, I wasn't there to absorb anything. I didn't want to learn anything. I didn't want to be there, but I was going to just go do my time. And I got, I was intoxicated and trashed the minute I left that place. It was going to be a long time before I would, approach the doorsteps of recovery. But, I came into King Alcohol at a young age. I grew up with a single mom. I grew up with a dad who was an alcoholic, who my mom ran off when I was born, somewhere between age 2 and 3. She ran him off, and it was just me and my mom growing up. And my mom, was divorced twice, no education, no family. Her parents died young. We didn't have any grandparents or uncles or aunts. It was just me and my mom, and she worked, minimum wage jobs for the most part. Usually had 2 or 3 things going on, so she was never home. And by the time I was 10 years old, I was coming and going however I wanted to go, and growing up on the streets. And the streets do what the streets do. And you experience a lot of dark things on the streets. And so that happened to me at a young age. And, I was a rock and roll drummer. I started playing music when I was young. 5 or so, I picked up the drumsticks for the first time. And it's a gift and a talent that served me well throughout my life. And so at that stage of my life, I was able to get in a lot of circles because of my drumming skills and all those type of things. And so it led me into a lot of dark-seated things at a pretty young age. The street drugs were there, the tobacco, the abuse, the sex abuse, the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, you pick it. I experienced all that stuff before I was even a teenager. But my first real drink came into my life right around the age of between 11 and 12 years old. Now, I was a Catholic boy growing up, and I know I drank altar wine. My mom had the cheapest beer on sale in her refrigerator her whole life till the day she died in 2015. And she always had a fifth of Old Crow underneath the sink. But I'm sure that I, drank some of her liquor at some point when I was younger, but I don't count any of that as my first real drink. What I'm talking about here is my first real drink, my first real experience with being fully intoxicated on booze. And I was about between 11 and 12 years old. And my buddy Steve, who was about 17 or 18, invited me to a party at his house. Now, I'd never been to a party, but I went to his house, and it was loud music, and there was noise going on, and there was girls, and there was smoke, and there was dope, and I liked all of it. It was scary, but I liked it all at the same time. And he was behind the bar playing the bartender, and I walk up to him, and he says, "Hey, man, what are you drinking?" And nobody ever asked me that before. And I said, "I guess whatever you're drinking is what I'm drinking." And he made me a big glass of slow gin and Coke. And I went over and sat down on the couch with it, and I finally got the courage to take a pull off it, and it tasted like cough syrup. I said, "Well, that's not too big a deal." And I took another pull off it, and eventually I started to get that sensation that we get in our face, in our body from the booze. And as I started to drink some more, I started to get a smile on my face like I never had before. And I drank some more, and the smile got a little bigger. And I drank some more, and eventually that smile wrapped all the way around my head, man. I mean, it just changed my life. It was apocalyptic. And what does apocalyptic means? It means that something's been revealed to you that's never been revealed before. And that's what happened with King Alcohol. The effect alcohol had on my life changed my life forever. From that moment until as I sit here today, my life would never be the same. And the effect that it had on my life, the way it made me feel, I was sold out to do that for the rest of my life at that instant. And I got as sick as I've ever been off alcohol probably that night. I'm sure I said my first foxhole prayer that night, and I probably said my first lie about how my alcoholic condition that night. I didn't drink the next day, probably the next week, or maybe even the next month. But I wanted to do that for the rest of my life, and I wanted to do it a lot. And growing up on the streets, not having any money, you just start stealing, you start hustling, and that's what I did. And that led into a life of crime and cost me a lot, and I ended up getting sentenced to a boys' home. And then from there, I ended up in the juvenile penitentiary and quit school. By the time I was 13, I was gone on the road out of my house by the time I was 15. And that's the way I lived. I hooked up with a drifter named Scotty. He was up in northern Missouri. He was about 45, maybe between 45 and 50. I'm 15, going on 16. And Scotty had an old UPS van that he had turned into a living quarters. And he was just a drifter in this town that I was in, Kirksville. He was hung around about 6 months, and I ran into him at different people's houses and parties. And I got word that he was going back to Austin, Texas. And I asked him if I could go with him. And he said, if probation or parole will let you go, I'll let you go with me. And of course, they signed off on it. And off I went with a guy I barely knew who was old enough to be my father. And off we went to Texas. And I lived all over the South, in Texas and Tennessee and Georgia, all over the place for the next 6-7 years. In my first run-in with King Alcohol, my first time that I ever just had any kind of concession or any kind of desire that I might want to do something different with my life or live differently came at the age of 19. And what I'm going to share with, especially the new folks tonight, what I'm going to share with you now is the alcoholic mind. And you'll hear this language in your day. You're going to hear about the alcoholic mind, this keen alcoholic mind. But this is that delusion I'm talking about. This is a great example of what that looks like and why it's so deadly. I was a blackout drinker from day one. I also loved the honky tonks, and down south you could drink in the honky tonks when you were 18. And I went there all the time, and I loved the bars. Man, I was a lunatic, and I loved the nightclubs. I loved the bars. I loved the girls in white T-tops, tight jeans, cowboy boots. They had a cowboy hat and a four-wheel drive, even better. God bless them. I loved that stuff. Couldn't get enough of it. And I found myself in those places. And I woke up one morning after being out all night, and woke up from a blackout like nothing uncommon, fully dressed. It was wintertime. I had on a flannel shirt and a beige sawed-off jacket. I had on blue jeans and a pair of cowboy boots. And I woke up with a big tomato head, just hung over as you could be from the night before. And as I looked down, I realized that I had blood all over me. I had blood splatter on my jacket, I had all over my hands. And as I'm trying to figure out what happened, I couldn't. And from that day until now, I couldn't tell you what happened. So I got up and I went into the restroom because I figured somebody just kicked the dog snot nasty out of me, because that was pretty common, really. I had a big mouth, and if I was drinking liquor and mix it with other things, there's a good chance somebody wanted to punch me at least once before the night was out. I was that obnoxious sometimes in those places. But as I went into the restroom and started to try to figure out where I was bleeding from, I realized that I'd been sliced all the way around my arm and stabbed in my rib cage. But that's not the important part of the story. I mean, it freaked me out, of course. And I went out on the front porch and I sat down, and I'm shaking because I'm a nervous wreck. I got tears in my eyes. I'm trying as desperate as I can to put together what happened. I couldn't do it. I still can't do it. But what happened next is what I really want to lean into, especially for the newcomers. Because as I sat there on that porch with tears, real tears in my eyes, mumbling things like, man, I got to do something different than I'm doing. Those type of things. It was like King Alcohol was sitting right next to me. It was like King Alcohol personified, just like he's sitting right next to me with his arm around me. I call him the great compromiser. And as I'm mumbling those words, man, I got to do something different than I'm doing now. King Alcohol says, you know what, kid? You're right. You do need to do something different. But before you do anything drastic, walk back here and grab your old army jacket, and let's walk up to the Magic Market and get a quart of beer and a pack of smokes. And that sounded like a really good idea, as insane as that sounds. And so I went and got the old army jacket. I didn't even wash my hands off. I started walking up to the Magic Market, and that sense of ease and comfort came over me before I ever got there. You know what I'm talking about if you're alcoholic. And I got there and I went in and I got the 40 ouncer. I got the pack of smokes. I come out. I made that noise we all love to make. I took the lid off that thing, and then that little I Dream of Jeannie popped out of the bottle. And I took that booze and I took a big old pull of it. I made that face we all like. And that was the last time I thought about not drinking for a long time. And friends, that's alcoholism. And that's the delusion of it. That delusion right there, that I'm not like everybody else, that I can't differentiate the truth from the false. My alcoholic life seems like the only normal one. That delusion is deadly. You know, that somehow or another I can control. I can pull it in whenever I want. I got this thing. Kills most people that have this illness. I hitchhiked to Marietta, Georgia. I got sewed up, and I wouldn't think about not drinking for a long time. I ended up back in St. Louis in 1985 and playing music over in East St. Louis pretty regular, over across the river from St. Louis over in Illinois. And coming home one night, me and the bandmates, I was in the back seat and on the passenger side, and it's wee hours of the morning, 2 or 3 in the morning. And as we're leaving the nightclub, we get on the highway and a spotlight hits our car and pulls us over. And we sat there. It seemed like a considerably long period of time. Probably wasn't really that long, but eventually the spotlight goes out, and it was just a pickup truck full of a bunch of knuckleheads with a pickup truck and messing with us, pretending they were law enforcement. And so we ended up in a high-speed chase with these guys. And it went on for quite a ways, headed back to St. Louis. And they swerved at us, we'd swerve at them. But ultimately, they swerved just a little bit too hard when they were in the fast lane. And when they did, they shot that truck just like a bottle rocket right up over the embankment. And it flipped countless times. And unfortunately, by the time it landed and come to a complete stop, it destroyed the truck and killed everybody inside the vehicle. Now, when we got home from that, in the daylight hours of the next day, I was a crushed guy. I mean, I was crushed to a point that I didn't think I'd ever come back from. It was just like somebody took out a piece of my soul and whacked it off. It was a really tough moment. And that's one of the dilemmas as an alcoholic, because there's nothing between you and whatever this monster is in your life, whether it's booze or drugs or food or sex or money, whatever it is, whatever character defect or shortcoming it is. If there's nothing between you and it, it's going to devour you every single time. And there was nothing between me and King Alcohol. And so King Alcohol persuaded me to drink again that morning. After I just come home from a fatality drunk driving accident, I'm drinking again just because I can't take the pain that I'm in. And it's the only thing I know to do is try to get the effect one more time. And I'm behind the wheel of a car just a week or so later, and I get arrested again for a 50 WI conviction. I had 4 and 5. I had a 4 DWI, I had the fatality drunk driving accident, I had that 50 WI within about a 6-week period. And so those DWIs were felonies and a parole violation for me, and I was on my way back to the penitentiary. I was 21 going on 22, and I was just a broken guy. You know, they had me isolated into a drunk tank by myself. I was in my underwear, probably weighed 140 pounds tops, and I was just a broken dude. And I got down on my knees in that jail cell, and I said the most honest prayer I've ever said in my life. And it was simply 3 words: God help me. I've heard that prayer a million times in AA, but it was honest. That was the difference between any other plea bargain prayer or foxhole prayer I've ever said in my life. This time it was honest. And I said it. And God's impact in my life was sudden and profound, because I've never had another drink from that day till now, almost 34 years later. It was a powerful, powerful experience. I bonded out, and I went back to that same treatment center I was in 1980, almost 200 miles from St. Louis. But that's where the seed of AA was planted. I knew there was something going on there, so I went back there. But I didn't go there to go to AA. I didn't go there necessarily to get sober. I didn't go there definitely to get a sponsor or do any of that stuff. I went there because I knew I needed that for the courts. I knew I needed something positive to show up at that court trial and say, at least I'm trying. And that was my only motivation for going to that place. And fortunately, I was 12-step by guy while I was there. His name was Gary, and he only had 2.5 months of sobriety. He just got out of the place before I got there. And but he was already jazzed about recovery. He was already on fire for this thing, and he was already coming back up. And he couldn't do a whole lot, but he could take people's like jokers like me to meetings, and that's what he was doing. And that's how I met him. And he came to my room, and he beat on the door, And I said, come in. And he walked in there and he had old Kansas City Chiefs hat on. He had prison issue glasses from the prison system. And he had a gruff old beard. He smoked his whole life. He had a little smoker's voice. And his name was Gary. He said, hey, you're on the list. You want to go to the meeting tonight? And I said, what meeting? He said, outside meeting. We're going to the outside meeting. I said, man, I'm not interested in any of that, but I appreciate it. And he left. And then he did something beautiful. He came right back a few minutes later and he stuck just his head into my room. And he said, well, hey, do me a favor. And I said, what's that? He goes, why don't you try to smile and get it over with? And then he left. And I sit there and thought about that statement for a minute, and it caused me to crack up, and I got a little laugh out of it. And then I eventually, next thing I know, this willingness out of nowhere came, and I'm up on my feet scouring the halls looking for this guy. And I found him, and off we went to my first AA meeting, outside of AA. But I came home, and this guy was persistent. And friends, I can't tell you how important that is. I mean, I think it's always important to remember in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous that it was Bill that found Bob, and it was Ebby that found Bill, and it was Gary who found Harold, because I wasn't going to go to this deal. And even when I got back to St. Louis, he continued to call me and check on me. Did you go to AA? No, I didn't go to AA. Harold, your life depends on it. And I knew that was a true statement. I really knew that deep down that was a true statement, but I was really at that crossroads. I could not picture my life without alcohol being part of it. And I could not picture my life continuing to drink any longer. I had a huge conundrum in my life. I couldn't picture life, alcohol with it or without it. I was at that jumping off place. I mean, I just really was. But eventually he taught me into going to AA. And I finally went to my first AA meeting in 1987. It was probably 90 days after I came home before I went to my first meeting. But I went to it. And I came to AA. And if you're listening, if you're new, this is what you shouldn't do. My story is about it just as much about what you shouldn't do as it is that you should do. I mean, it's really pretty balanced. This is what you shouldn't do. I came to AA the same way I did everything else in my life. I'm going to do it how I want, when I want, the way I want. If you don't like it, too bad, because that's how I'm going to do it. It's just how I did it my whole life. And I came to AA, and I loved the meetings. I loved you people. I loved hanging out with you. Loved to go eat with you. Love to fellowship with you. Love to play music with you. Play softball. Go on sober float trips. Go to AA dances. Do all the fellowship stuff. Go to potlucks. But I didn't want to sponsor. I had a probation or parole officer since I was 11 years old. I was not interested in that. They didn't even attract me at all. I just don't want any part of that in my life. And as far as the steps go, I just didn't believe the steps were going to change my life. That was just to cut to the chase. That's really what it was. I just didn't see how that was going to change my life. I had such an individualistic, consumeristic, completely self-reliant worldview of how life should go. In my thinking, my world that I lived in, call me crazy, but I think I could be a little bit more happy, joyous, and free if I had a few $100s in my pocket. Call me crazy. It made sense to me. If I had a job that I could actually work that was a decent job, and a legal driver's license, and a car that wasn't held together by bumper stickers, I think I could be a little bit more happy, joyous, and free. And that was my mindset. It really was. And but here in AA, and especially for the newcomers, it's the steps that are going to transform your life. I mean, I'll just be straight to it, to the point. Our life didn't change as a result of these meetings. Our life changes because of the result of the steps. And the steps is the program. And if you're going to wander around AA and live inside a 12-step program and never work the steps, well, that's pretty insane. And that's what I was doing. I was on step none. I mean, you could argue I was on 0.5 because I did concede to my innermost self that I was alcoholic. But I definitely didn't believe that the rest of this stuff was going to change my life. But eventually, you can only live off that. You can only live off self-propulsion. Even in recovery rooms, you can only do it for so long, and you're going to blow your life up. Or you're going to come to the end of yourself. And hopefully you come to the end of yourself before you burn your life into the ground. And that's what happened to me. I finally came to the end of myself. And it took me, friends, almost 3 years for me to get to that place. But finally, at 3 years, right at 3 years, I asked this guy to sponsor me. And I went to his house and I sat down with him. And he said, Harold, you've been around for almost 3 years now. I've known you the whole time for the most part. Tell me about your life. Tell me where you're at. His name was Roy. I said, Roy, I'll tell you where I'm at. I'm 25 years old. I live in the basement of the house. I don't have a driver's license. I've never legally had a driver's license. I got a dead end job. I don't have any education. I don't even have a GED. I got a criminal record. I got a piece of crap car that's held together by 8 bumper stickers. My life sucks just every which way you could take it. Just take the word sucks, put it in all cap letters, highlight it, bold it, put Christmas lights around it, and just flash it. Sucks, sucks, sucks. That's where my life was at. And I hadn't drank in 3 years, and that's where my dilemma was. And we sat there and he listened to me gracefully. When I got done, what he said changed my life. And he said, Harold, I hear everything you're sharing with us, brother. I hear everything you're sharing. And there's no doubt that you've been dealt a tough hand in life. No question about it. But I hope you're going to hear what I'm going to tell you. And what he shared with me that night, my friends, is as true that day as it is right here tonight on February 27th, 2021. It's exactly the same truth. And what he shared with me was simply this: Harold, every single thing you have in your life right now, sitting at my kitchen table, every single thing you have in your life, you've attracted to you by the person that you become. And the day you're man enough to own that is the day you're on your way to some real change. But until you can own that, this little vicious cycle you're going on, you're eventually going to drink again because you're not happy about your sobriety. Or you're going to do what my dad did. My dad stuck a shotgun in his mouth and took his life. That's how my dad quit drinking. So it's ultimately going to boil down to this. You're either going to do one or two things. You're either going to grow or you're going to go. And the $1 million question is, what do you want to do? And I didn't want to go. I mean, I loved you people. I mean, I really did. I felt at home here. But I just didn't believe the 12 steps were going to change my life. And it's really it's really the difference between world mathematics and spiritual mathematics. And the spiritual mathematics we talk about here in AA, or at least I talk about it in that way, we find that formula on page 64. The equation for spiritual mathematics is on page 64. And it simply says this: that when we put the spiritual ahead of the material, we straighten out physically, we straighten out mentally, emotionally. We just start to straighten out when we put the spiritual ahead of everything else. I'd always put the world in front of everything in my life, my whole life, and have fallen into many ruts in sobriety, doing the same thing, putting the world ahead of the spiritual. And every time there's a cost to be paid when you do that. But this, my friends, was a matter of life and death. And that's really the truth. In the 34 years, I sponsor lots of guys over the course of 34 years. I've never met one person, not one single one yet, that's fully come all the way in, sit all the way down, and lived into this thing to the fullest until their life depended on it. And so for you that are newer here tonight, Miguel, Melinda, and Cheyenne, and Melissa, I hope that's where you're at. I hope you're at a place where your life depends on it. Because if it is, then hopefully you'll find the willingness to come all the way into this thing. But I was, and I knew he was going to say, let's work the steps. And we started that journey, and it tasted so good I never stopped from that day till now. Now, my life didn't change in one big cataclysmic explosion, but little by little, my life started to take off. And like I said, I've never let out the gas from that day to now. But it brought me to the place of the next 4 delusions I'm going to talk about. So delusion number 1, I'm not alcoholic. Kills most of us. Thank God I survived it. And I know what that delusion means today, and I'm not under its power anymore today. That's been arrested a long time ago. But I quickly fell into delusion number 2. Delusion number 2 is when I can come to the rooms and I can concede that I'm alcoholic. I can say my name is Harold and I am an alcoholic and own that. But it's not my fault, man. It's not my fault. It's called victimization. And the problem with victimization is I can drink myself to death and it's not my fault. I can blow my veins out. I can blow my nostrils out. I can blow my lungs out. I can blow my brains out. And it's not my fault. I can spend the rest of my life in a 9x7 or 10x6 jail cell, and it's not my fault. And it just as our 4-step would say, to conclude that others is wrong is about as far as most of us ever got. That's what they're talking about. It's called victimization. It's that card. And there's probably some people on here stuck deep into it. They may be up to here with it. And it's a deadly place to be. And I was stuck there. I took no ownership for my life. And that has to change. And that's, when we talk about that mysterious 4-column, or however you want to frame the 4-step, when we set aside the wrongdoings of others and we start to look at our part in it, that's where I got liberation. That's where I started to get a lot of freedom here when I was able to do that. But that delusion, that it's not my fault was heavy. And I'm not saying, because there's people on here like myself who suffered a lot of things at the hands of a lot of people, even as a kid, that you wouldn't wish on anybody. And so I wasn't fully responsible for it, but I ultimately, the other choices that I made in my life, many of the choices that put me into the conditions my life were in, I made those choices. And I had to own that. And that wasn't easy. But once I did, there was a lot of liberation that came from that. But it quickly put me right up against delusion number 3. So delusion number 1, I'm not an alcoholic. Delusion number 2, I am alcoholic, but it's not my fault. Victimization. Delusion number 3 is I get to that place where I can come to the rooms and I am alcoholic. I can concede it. I'll take responsibility for my life. I'll own it. Okay, I'm the guy. I'm the bad guy. I got a part in all this. But let's just be real with each other, man. I burnt my life too far in the ground. I broke too many hearts. I burnt too many bridges. It's too big a mountain to high. To climb. There's not enough time left in my life to ever restore any of this stuff. It's just impossible. It's a delusion of impossibility. And when that delusion really sets in and it really trickles down and it gets into your heart and your heart gets full of discouragement, guess what you do? You just quit. And so you might run up against a lot of these people. Maybe you're in that place today where you just quit. You don't even get started because you're already defeated. You're already discouraged. That's why we have a recidivism rate of 60, 70% in the prison system. Because when these men and women walk out of prison, they're already going back before they leave because their life's never going to be anything than what it is. It's impossible for me to change. It's impossible for me to have a life that has any value or meaning to it whatsoever. So why even try? Well, let's just be real with each other. I mean, come on. And so that delusion's powerful, friends. I mean, it's absolutely powerful when you just quit and give up. And I was there. I was at that place. I just didn't see how my life was ever going to materialize into anything. It didn't make any sense to me. Looking at the 12 steps, paying back money, meeting people, saying I'm sorry, trying to reconcile with people, doing that stuff. It just didn't make any sense how that was going to change my life. It just didn't. But again, because I was desperate, I started to do those things. And my life started to get better and I started to get opportunities. And then guess what? The impossible became possible. My sponsor, Tom, has a great quote. Tom would say this all the time. When preparation meets opportunity and God does the introduction, amazing things can happen in your life. And the reality, friends, in those first early years of sobriety, I wasn't prepared for the opportunities that came my way. But as I started to live into the steps, my life started to change and the opportunities started to come. The breaks started to come. As Tom would say, when the walls come down, when God's got work for you to do, the walls come down. And 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4 anymore. And the impossible becomes possible. And that's really, really good news for people like us that came here with a 150-pound bag of crap. We came here with our life in a 1,000-piece puzzle with a lot of pieces missing. And that, my friends, leads to a huge heart full of discouragement. How are we ever going to overcome this? And it's powerful. And it holds us hostage. And that's where my life was at. But I came here and I dumped my 1,000-piece puzzle out on the table. And my sponsor, many of you people like yourselves, all helped me start to put this puzzle back together. Even though there were some pieces missing, it still started to look like a mosaic. It started to really change my life. But I quickly ran up against delusion number 4. And delusion number 4 is I'm spiritually disqualified. Because of the things I've done in my life, the people that I've hurt, the things that I've done, the things that I still think from time to time, there's no way that I'm ever going to be on the right side when it comes to this power. And when I sat in meetings, and of course I was on step none for the first 3 years, but when I sat in meetings and people would talk about God or they talk about this spiritual connection, they talk about hearing the spirit or feeling the spirit or God spoke to them or God said this or they were inspired to do this. I couldn't relate to any of that. God sounded like this to me. You just put your fingers in your ears. That's what God sounded like. And so when you experience that long enough, you start to think there's something wrong with you, that I'm disqualified. And maybe the hard luck I'm suffering in life, maybe why I'm not getting any breaks, maybe why I'm not even getting this thing called recovery is because I'm spiritually disqualified. I'm suffering spiritual condemnation. I'm suffering spiritual persecution. But once I started to work the steps, especially that 4 step, and I call it tube spirituality is what I call it. It's like this tube, this is the tube. This is our tube to this power. Well, my tube, friends, was completely shut. It was filled with you can just visualize it full of rocks and dirt and debris, and call that the resentments, call that the fears, call that the secrets. My life was full of that stuff. And so there was nothing going to get through this channel, nothing. But as I took the lid off this tube and I started to share the resentments for the first time in my life, and I started to share the fears for the first time in my life, and I started to share the secrets that I wasn't ever going to tell anybody, which most of them centered around my sex conduct or centered around crimes that I committed that I never got caught for. That's typically where those secrets are at. But when I started to share that stuff, guess what happened? My tube started to open up. My tube started to clear up. And the more I did it, the more clear it got. And that's why I believe on page 75 of the big book, when it talks about step 5, and I'm paraphrasing, but it says basically at this juncture of the steps is when a lot of members in Alcoholics Anonymous, claim to have had their first spiritual experience. It's when they really felt the presence of God in their life. And that was really, I'm textbook, big book. That's exactly what happened in my life. This tube got cleaned out and I could finally start to hear. I could finally start to experience. I started to develop that vital sixth sense that we would talk about. And so 10, 11, and 12 are just a regular journey to keep this tube clean, to keep it open and not allow junk to get back into it, because life happens. Resentments are going to continue to happen. Conflict's going to happen. Stuff's not going to go my way. And that stuff can lead to stuff that gets in my tube. And if it gets in there and it gets clogged, guess what? God's voice goes deaf. Your voice goes deaf, at least to a mumble. And eventually I get burnt out. Eventually I get tired. And eventually I leave. And I've seen it happen to too many people in my 34 years. So I was able to get liberated from those four things. I was able to get rid of that victim card. I was able to finally realize that the impossible can happen here. And the beautiful part about it is, over all these years, that I've watched the impossible happen for a lot of people that just seemed impossible. And then, ultimately, I was able to start having this connection with this power, and it's tasted so good. I've never stopped from that day till now. And my life started to take off. And so the walls came down, and I was able to get a lot of breaks. And friends, I've got a lot of breaks in recovery, but I was prepared for those breaks. I was spiritually mature enough to lean into those breaks. And my life took off. I got an opportunity to get into a field of business that I didn't even qualify to take out the trash at. And I got into it at 3 years sobriety when I started working the steps, of course. And I made the most of that. I worked hard, I worked smart, I worked honest. And I achieved a lot of things, and I started to make a really good living. But eventually, after about 12 years in that job, I ran into CAB. I couldn't go any further because I didn't have a formal education. And I was at a crossroads. And again, this seemed like an impossible feat. My sponsor said, well, why don't you just go take your GED and maybe think about going back to college? And I said, I can't just pass my GED. I quit school when I was 13, man. And I said, I've tried to get my GED a couple of times while I was incarcerated, and both times I just got discouraged with it and quit. So it might be easy for you, but it's not easy for me. I can't just go sit down and pass a GED. Sorry, but I can't. All right, well, good. Then why don't you just go sign up for classes? I said, what do you mean sign up for classes? Why don't you just go sign up for classes? And so that ended up being a community college. And so I'm double-digit sobriety by this time. But I go back to a community college, and I walk into my first GED class, and I'm dressed in a suit kind of like I am tonight. I'm already starting to have gray hair. And immediately they thought I was the instructor as soon as I walked in. I said, I am not the instructor, man. I just sat down where I didn't have to look at him. I just sat in the front row and put my eyes on the teacher. And I spent my 16 weeks there going through that. And I sat for the GED, and I passed it. And I passed it with a pretty high score, which allowed me to go on and go to college. And I was able to walk across the stage and get a bachelor's degree. And that was a big deal for me, and be able to send my mom a bumper sticker that said, hey, your kid made the honor roll. It was a huge joke in our family, but I finally was able to go do that. And ultimately, I was able to walk across the stage and get a master's degree in business. And in that master's degree, for my thesis, I wrote a business plan to start a business from scratch and sell it. And I've been able to do that not once, but twice in my recovery. And then I was able to walk across the stage that long ago, really, and get another master's degree. So, friends, what I'm telling you is the possible does become possible here when your life changes and when you live into this thing. The walls do come down and the opportunities happen. I'm married today. This is my wife, Susie. We got 5 kids. I got 4 girls and 1 boy. I never knew I could fall in love with a little bald-headed woman with no teeth until they handed me one and said, "Here you go, Dad." And I fell in love with her pretty fast. And that was the youngest one, the oldest one now. But there's 4 girls and a boy. The youngest one's 23 years old today, and they've all grown up. They're all educated. 2 of the girls are married, no grandkids yet, but none of them have burnt their life around. They're all educated. None of them are, out there doing anything nuts. They never watched their dad go through any of my darkest periods of my life at all. And I'm forever grateful for that. Who would have thought it? I would have never thought that was ever possible when I got here. But it's possible, friends. It's a beautiful thing. The last delusion I want to talk about was one that I really struggle with, especially in the newness of sobriety. And that was the delusion that there's no real purpose for my life. There's no real purpose for any of this stuff. We do all this work, we do all this stuff for what? So we just don't drink? I mean, what is the purpose? What purpose is there for my life? I mean, I've caused so much havoc. I mean, what can really come out of my life? And it's a fair question. I mean, all these questions I'm raising, and we all have these questions at different times of our sobriety, they're fair questions to ask. And I ask this question, what purpose is there? But today, it's easy for me to look back because we talk about, several of our big purposes all the time today. We talk about our primary purpose when we read the preamble. We talk about our singleness of purpose in our traditions. We talk about our group purpose in our traditions. And then we talk about our real purpose, which we find that language on page 77, which is to fit ourselves to be a maximum service to God and the people in our life. And so my job, your job, our calling, your calling, is to give freely what's been given to me. And if I don't do that, well, friends, it's nothing more than gross negligence. It'd be no different than if I had a cure for COVID-19 and didn't share it with anybody but myself or a few close friends. It would be on that level. But the fact that I've been spared from this hopeless state of mind and body, this illness that wipes out 3.5 million people a year, I owe it to my brothers and sisters coming behind me to give them the good news, to tell them there is hope, to be a hand there to help them walk across that 12-step bridge, to make it up the 12-step path. It's my job, your job to do that. And so I discovered that purpose here. And that came through sponsorship. And what I'm going to really wind down with is this, and this is for everybody, because this is what has transformed my life, what I'm about to share with you. This is what I live into today. It's what started me on my track when I started this journey back in 1990. I was already 3 years not drinking, but this is where my life really took off in AA. So my sponsor said there's 2 things you need to do for the rest of your life. And if you do these 2 things for the rest of your life, you're going to have a storybook life. You're going to go on to have a life beyond your wildest dreams. And here's the 2 things you need to do for the rest of your life. Number 1, you need to make sure you always have a new guy you're working with. I don't care what you're doing, where you're at in life. I don't care how many meetings you're going to. I don't care about any of that stuff. If you don't have a new person that you're walking this journey with, you stop what you're doing. You get out your rods, you get out your bait, you go fish where there's fish, and you find one. And hopefully you got more than one. Maybe you got a couple of them that you're trudging this road with. But you always have one. And on page 100 of our big book, this good old book right here, is probably one of the greatest promises, if not the greatest promises in the big book, that really summarizes that call to action. And I'll just read it because it's just a little paragraph and it's so good. But listen to what it says. And most of you know it by heart, but many of you don't. And this is what my sponsor was telling me to do right here. He says, both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. And if you persist, there's the kicker, remarkable things will happen. When we look back, we realize that the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned. Anything we could have planned. Follow the dictates of a higher power, and you will presently live in a new and wonderful world, no matter what your present circumstances. And friends, that is an amazing, amazing promise. And the good news about it is it's true. And it's exactly what happened in my life. So that's number 1. Always have a new guy you work with. Number 2, I want you committed to going somewhere once a week where you don't want to end up. And you can pick where that's at. I don't care where it's at. It could be a treatment center, a halfway house, Skid Row mission, county jail, prison, don't care. But I want you to go somewhere once a week where you don't want to end up. If you do those 2 things for the rest of your life, one day at a time, you will have a storybook life. You will have a life beyond your wildest dreams. And for me, that started here in St. Louis at the Skid Row Mission on Washington Street called Harbor Life, Salvation Army Harbor Life, which was a combination of a homeless shelter for men, but also a low bottom Skid Row treatment center. And so starting in 1990, I went there every Thursday night and every Saturday morning. Hardest AA I ever done. Worked with the most broken people I ever worked with. But during that time, it helped me to do AA in a way I never knew possible. It helped me uncover, discover, and discard a lot of isms that I had in my life that I didn't ask for, but I had them. It helped me to uncover, discard a lot of phobias I had in my life. And all those things come to the surface because I was in that environment. I was in that context. In 1993, a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, man, what do you think about coming out and doing a talk at this prison?" I started laughing. I said, "Dude, do you know who you're talking to?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Man, they're not going to let me come out to that prison and talk." He goes, "Man, I think you've been off paper long enough now. We can probably get you in there." I said, "Man, let's just be real. Even if they would let me come into that place, I made a pact a long time ago, man. I ain't never going back on that side of the fence for you or him or them or anybody else. So I'm not really interested. Well, why don't you run that by your sponsor and call me back?" And of course, you know what he said. And if they let you in, you'll go. And of course, he went with me. But right after that, I went to the middle of the state of Missouri to a prison in the middle of the state. Was invited to go to a one-day workshop where it was an AA workshop, but the workshop was being put on by the offenders, not the outsiders, not the volunteers, but the offenders. And I went there, and I was absolutely blown away by the level of sobriety and magnitude of this AA group inside this prison. And then afterwards, the ones of us that came from the outside, that part of the reason to bring us there was to invite us to come into the prison system. And so me and my buddy Henry did that. And they wanted us to start a meeting in a maximum security prison outside of St. Louis that didn't have any AA in it at all. And we did that starting right around that time, right there at the early mid 90s. And we've been in ever since. They haven't been able to kick us out yet. We've been in that prison system. We haven't been in because of COVID-19, but since March. But I go to a treatment center in its place. I go to a place called Sauna Lake, which is about 20 minutes from my house. And we do a meeting there on Sunday nights, and I do a group there on my own on Wednesday afternoons. So I take that very seriously, those two things. Always having a new guy, going somewhere once a week I don't want to end up. It's truly changed my life. It's led to a life beyond my wildest dreams. I've had every hardship and trial that you could have just about in my life. Pick a subject, and I can tell you how I fought it, how I wrestled with it, how it's kicked dog snot nasty out of me, but I've been able to overcome it and continue on this journey. It's a beautiful ride. So wherever you're at on your spiritual journey, I hope you learn that there's hope here for you wherever you're at. Those delusions are powerful. I was able to face them, uncover them, but also face them and live through them. But the 5 delusions: 1, I'm not alcoholic. 2, I am alcoholic, but it's not my fault. 3, I am alcoholic. I'll take ownership for my life, but it's too late for me, man. It's impossible for my life to really amount to anything. Delusion number 4 is that I'm spiritually disqualified. And delusion number 5, that there's no real value or worth or purpose for my life. All those things are nothing but delusions. But when you're stuck in them, they seem very, very real. And life seems impossible. And this seemingly hopeless state of mind can stay that way even when you divorce yourself from King Alcohol. Your life can seem pretty hopeless and pointless and meaningless and without any real hope that it's going to change. And I'm just telling you, it can change. No matter how far down the scale your life has gone, you can have an amazing life. I'll close with this. On page 152, it says this. It asks the question point blank. It says, do you have a sufficient substitute for King Alcohol? That's the question posed to the book. And the book responds with yes, and it's vastly more than that. It's a fellowship in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that word fellowship, they're using it in a verb form, not a noun, meaning that I have to participate in my own recovery. But if I come into this thing and I live this thing out, the steps are not systematic. It isn't like I go buy this desk I'm sitting at Walmart, come home, open these 12 steps, and you got this desk. No, the steps are an adaptation. They're a set of principles. Spiritual nature, it's a way of life. We're meant to live this thing out, not systematically put it together where it's one and done. It's a way of life. And I've chosen it, and it's made a huge difference in my life. It goes on to say, if you do that, if you live into this thing, then the most satisfactory years of your existence lie ahead. Your imagination is going to be fired, and you're going to make some lifelong friends here. And friends, that's really the truth. When I came here, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't have one person I could call. I couldn't even call my own mother anymore. That's the world. There wasn't a person in the world that I could call. Today, I got a phone full of contacts. I got more people that I can do justice with that are in my life today. My life got pretty big in 34 years, but it was really small when I got here. So that statement that you're going to make lifelong friends is true. But it concludes over on the top of page 153 when it gives us the task of carrying this message. And then we ask the question, well, where are we going to find these people? And the book responds with rich and low, rich and poor, high and low. They're everywhere. If you're in an urban area, they're everywhere. And it's really the truth. We're without excuse to have a new person to do this journey with. But it says on the top of page 153, it says, you're going to have the privilege, and I'm paraphrasing, to walk shoulder to shoulder with people and help them rediscover life. And once you do that long enough, you're going to finally know what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. That you're going to have this huge paradigm shift that happens in your life. You're going to shift from being a taker to a giver. It's 18 inches from your head to your heart. And when you get this heart transplant, when your heart gets transformed, because the heart of the problem is the problem with the heart. And when that gets shifted, when that gets changed, friends, it tastes so good. I call it spiritual intoxication. We're all get high freaks here. We all love to be intoxicated, but it's spiritual intoxication. And you remember what you did the night before. You don't go to jail for it. And it's a pretty good buzz to have. I love it. But AA has given me a life, my whole life back. Gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. And it will for you too, regardless of where you're at on this journey. It can happen for you, but you're going to have to come all the way in and sit all the way down and really give yourself to this thing. And I hope you do that because it'll sure make a big difference in your life. Thank you for allowing me to come and be with you tonight. Thank you for my life, because without you, I wouldn't have one. That's all I got. Thanks.